Next on the Capital Connection, Blair Horner, Executive Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group. We talk about environmental legislation in New York. We'll also talk about the coming presidential election and whether young people in New York and around the country will come out to vote. That's Blair Horner, Executive Director of NYPI, on this week's Capital Connection. Next. Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative, and United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. With us, Blair Horner. You know him. He's the Executive Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPI. He's been mostly there for his career. He's had a few different changes. But you can find out more about NYPI at NYPIRG.org. In the interest of full disclosure, Blair does commentary for WAMC. He sits on our board of trustees. He's back again. Welcome back, Blair.
Thanks for having me.
Blair, there's one thing, and I don't want to talk out of school here, but we should let the audience know that if I fall down on the job and I can't get anybody to agree to come on the program, a lot of times I say, time to call Blair Horner. You're not the only one. I have a couple of backups, but you're great, Blair. You will always be ready and willing to talk about New York State government and politics whenever I call, and I want to thank you for that, and also at the same time scold everyone else who delays, humps, and fumps, and doesn't come on a program where they get to talk about the issues they care about.
Well, when there's an emergency, break glass. And I guess I'm in that category.
You're right there behind the glass. And, you know, your number falls
Right.
out. I call you. You answer it, unless it doesn't say where you're calling from. And there you are. And right now, you are sitting in the hot seat. So I want to literally talk about the hot seat in that we have this growing climate issue. And making climate polluters pay, as your column points out, is gaining national attention. We see what's been happening in New York, where you could argue that the governor suspending the congestion pricing plan was not doing good for the climate, as well as some of the climate legislation that was stalled at the end of session. Blair, what are you thinking right now as we see tornadoes at a higher rate across New York, as we even have seen in the past and will continue? Wildfires, yes, in New York State, not just in Canada. And, of course, the shifting ability to reach our climate goals.
You've outlined a lot of different issues.
And when you're done, the show will be over. Thank you.
Exactly. Just so the listeners know, the Climate Change Superfund Act is a legislation that passed both houses in Albany and is scheduled at some point to go to the governor's desk. And the bill basically says that the state is facing huge costs due to climate change and the resulting more intense storms, which wash away roads and make schools hotter and make people sicker and make the air quality worse. I mean, all of those things cost money to deal with. And so the Superfund Act basically says that the oil companies should pick up at least part of the tab. Vermont actually passed a similar bill earlier this year in June, and it's along the same lines because in Vermont there have been now twice the state capital has been flooded because of more intense storms in that state, and there's been more and more intense storms because of the changing climate and the rapidly heating planet. So the question really is who do you want to pay? The taxpayers, the oil companies? We argue the oil companies because they've known for decades, for at least 50 years, that the burning of fossil fuels would lead to a worsening climate and global warming, and that's exactly what's happened. And instead of being good corporate citizens and warning everybody, they bamboozled the public with phony baloney ads and spent campaign contributions on legislators who would not do anything about it and front groups. And so now we're stuck. And so we think they should pick up part of the tab, and they have the money to do it. So that's a little bit different than all of the other things you were talking about in terms of like how do you transition from a fossil fuel-based powered economy to one that's not. And the state is slipping behind on its climate goals. There's a law on the books, the Climate Act, which sets specific goals and a phase out of the reliance on fossil fuels by 2050, which is what the world's scientists say have to happen. And New York is slipping past its goals. Its first goal is coming up in 2030 in terms of, I believe, 70% of its power the state's power coming from non-fossil fuel sources, and it's nowhere near that. And so, there's a lot of rhetoric out of Albany. Turns out to be hot air, and unfortunately, it can't be used to generate power for the state of New York.
We're speaking with Blair Horner. He is the executive director of NYPI, the New York Public Interest Research Group. If there's anybody out there that doesn't know about it, what is the New York Public Interest Research Group? We might as well do that again at this point.
Well, we're a 50-year-old nonpartisan, not-for-profit corporation that was organized in 1973 to really have a dual mission. One was to, impact public policy to benefit the public and to give college students an opportunity to participate in civic life. 1973 was, the end of the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was still pushing for changes. The women's rights movement was advocating, and environmentalism was advocating. And so out of that came the PIRGs, public interest research groups across the country. The idea was to sort of institutionalize way for students, young people, young adults, to impact policy all across the country. And that's where we started. And now it's, we've been around for 50 years. And
you still have a hell of a lot of work to do, don't you, Blair?
Yes. Well, democracy is a work in progress. You never quite finish it, and you always have to keep at it to make it better.
Well, and because of so many interest groups that are fighting for their piece of the legislative pie, oftentimes it's one step forward, three steps back. Now, let's continue this conversation about the climate. You mentioned transitioning is a whole different thing. Now I see the Business Council of New York State is out with recommendations. They say they need a more, quote, thoughtful and practical approach to the climate transition. They're supporting several statewide campaigns. The Business Council has three primary concerns. React to these for me, Blair. Higher energy prices, whose impacts would ripple through the state's economy. Reduced reliability of the state's energy grid that would affect homes, institutions, and businesses. Adverse impacts on the state's overall economic climate that may discourage new investments and job growth. Political or practical?
Well, I mean, the Business Council has been advocating against a lot of these environmental initiatives and climate initiatives now for years, and that is, that's their orientation. They are more focused on those issues than they are what impact not doing anything has on the climate. Let's start with the basic facts. The world's experts at the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is a global group organized by the United Nations of the world's top thousands of climate scientists. They say that to avert catastrophe for the planet, the world has to be off fossil fuels by the middle of this century, basically net zero greenhouse gas emissions.
We just marked
And
3 hottest days on record ever, right?
right, right, well, and it's every year is on average hotter than the previous year. And the world's experts say in order to do that, you have to curb greenhouse gas emissions. You have to work towards zero by the middle of the century. Otherwise, it's a catastrophe for civilization on the planet, not also to mention all of the other species that are not human. So that's what the science tells you. And the affordability question, which the Business Council raises, imagine how expensive it's going to be to live in circumstances where the planet is out of control in terms of its climate change. That's going to be an enormous cost, economic, human terms, and the environment generally.
And we're already seeing it, as you referenced, in Vermont and New York, of course.
Yeah, well, and New York, right? I mean, there's been unprecedented numbers of tornadoes, more intense storms. Last year, people might remember, at the end of May, beginning of June into July, the air quality was terrible. In fact, the air in New York City turned orange at one point because of Canadian wildfires. Now, all of that, the wildfires are not just about climate change. Sometimes they're about arson. But when you have a drier forestry and drier undergrowth, anything like that, a lightning strike, arson, whatever it is, makes the storms worse. So you start with the science. The science says the world has to get off fossil fuels. The United States is not moving fast enough. California, New York, Massachusetts, those are the states that have to lead the parade. That's what the state's climate law does. It can't be more thoughtful than being based on science. Now, because the state is dragging its feet, that could be the reason why we're not going to meet the goals. It has more to do with a failure of political will than it does the practicality of the goals. New York is not at the lead in terms of a lot of the renewable goals that in the country. California's had, I think, 100 straight days of at least part of each day being powered by 100% non-fossil fuel power.
Renewables, yeah. Well, but Blair,
so it's like, what are you supposed to do? You go with the science. You don't whine and complain about the lobbying interests that are basically lobbying for the petroleum industry. They have had a history of not wanting to do anything.
But what about New York Governor Kathy Hochul? There she was with the Pope talking about climate. Then she comes home and she suspends the congestion pricing plan. Is that a lack of political will?
Well, God knows what's going on there, right? I mean, the governor goes to, you're right, goes to Italy as a co-chair of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a state group of states where the governors are basically get together and argue for more aggressive climate policy to meet the science-based goals that I just discussed. The governor goes to Italy, then goes to Ireland. And in fact, in Ireland, crows about the fact that we finally got congestion pricing done. 17 days later, comes back to Albany and says we're not going to do congestion pricing, or at least pause it. Now, we don't really know what's going to happen, in terms of what the governor's plans are. She's talking about, I guess, redoing it in the context of the upcoming state budget. But we don't know how all of that's going to work out. But you can't, on the one hand, you crow about we're the ones who finally got congestion pricing done. And then 2 weeks later come to Albany and say, we're not doing congestion pricing. That does undermine environmental policy. You're right about that. It undermines the city's mass transit system, New York City's mass transit system, which is the lifeblood of New York State's economy. And, by the way, also could blow a big hole in the state budget and unravel the end of session. We didn't agree with the governor's plans, that's for sure.
Right. I mean, the comptroller, DiNapoli, is warning about the problem with this financial hole now blown through the transit system because of not following through on this. We also have seen studies. I've read articles about how it has worked, for example, in London, when a lot of people weren't happy about the idea of paying more to get it, for example, into parts of London. But once it was instituted, there was almost an immediate receptiveness to less congestion and a cleaner environment. Most people reacted positively.
Yeah, I mean, no one likes to pay more for anything when it comes to services. So that's understandable. You're right that once the tolls were put into place in London and in other places, actually, the public got used to it, and that was that. It just became part of the way that people live. But in New York City, if the mass transit system is drastically underfunded, which is what is happening now, the city doesn't work. And if the city doesn't work, New York State's economy is in big trouble. It's sort of like before when we talk about the Business Council and environmental issues. The science says we have to get off fossil fuels. And so all of the other stuff is really just about noise. So when it comes to congestion pricing, that's a $15 billion hole. Unless that money is there in some fashion, the city won't work right. And if the city doesn't work right, it's catastrophic consequences for the state and arguably has a terrible impact on the nation.
Well, and there's other terrible impacts as a result of climate change, and we know it. The science, as you keep saying, says so, and you've written about this, and this comes with health. I mean, we already went through a pandemic. The scientists tell us it's not if, but when another one could occur, and you have a column where you write about these antibiotic-resistant bacteria now, and that has to do with a lot of reasons, including the use in our food system as well.
Yeah, this is the quiet epidemic. And, I hate to bum all the listeners out, but on top of everything else, the use of antibiotics is becoming less and less helpful in terms of dealing with infections. And, we live, all of us, all the listeners have basically grown up in a world of antibiotics, which really are being used in a significant way after World War II. And they're like miracles, right? So 1,000 years ago, if you got scraped on your knee because you were working in the field, you could die. And that never happened after World War II in the developed world because people had access to antibiotics. The use of antibiotics and overuse of antibiotics for everything creates a small but growing percentage of those infections that are resistant to the drugs. And people, when they hear about this, they hear about what are called superbugs, these kinds of infections that are not treatable, easily treatable, or not at all treatable by antibiotics. And so what the World Health Organization says that if nothing is done, if new drugs don't come on the market to replace the antibiotics that don't work, by the middle of this century, more people worldwide will die of antibiotic-resistant infections than die of cancer. And so that's mind-boggling to think about. And the column that you referred to, I was looking at how many new drugs are there in the pipeline that have been developed on antibiotics. And there's been a total of 4. And so that's not going to meet the need. And the idea is to get the Congress and the government to invest more in the research and development of new medicines that can sort of stand in the place of the antibiotics that are losing their impact against these new superbugs that are resistant.
Yeah, and, we always think about pollution-causing vehicles when we think about fossil fuel burning, gas-powered vehicles, diesel-powered, and that's causing so much of the problems with heating the climate. But in fact, methane, factory farming, is the largest source of climate warming emissions than all the cars put together. And I don't know that Americans are going to change their diets to help reduce, this methane.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 big drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. One is carbon dioxide, which is the burning of fossil fuels, and that generates carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. It accumulates. It becomes like a warm blanket over the planet. Unfortunately, it's a warm blanket in a rapidly heating planet. Methane is also a product of, you're right, in agriculture, but also even in the extraction of gas,
right,
natural gas out of the ground, methane is emitted. They're different in how they impact on the planet. Carbon dioxide has less of an impact per molecule, but lasts longer in the atmosphere in terms of its impact. Methane is a more powerful blanket, but doesn't last as long. And so if you're trying to avert the worldwide average of greenhouse gas emissions, and what scientists say is like you can't go beyond basically 2.7% Fahrenheit increase in the heat of the planet, compared to 1880 when industrialization started. Methane really becomes an important substance that you want to dramatically reduce because that accelerates the heating more because its capacity to hold heat in is greater than carbon dioxide. And so it is, you're right, it's a lot of that methane does come from agricultural production and what we eat. And, of course, what we eat is going to be under threat and is under threat because a rapidly heating planet impacts farm animals, the ability to grow crops, I mean, increasingly countries are looking at how do you develop food supplies that are local that can handle the population. And I think our diets are going to have to change, and they're going to have to change dramatically for the same reasons that you have to move off fossil fuel powered energy sources and cars, is because otherwise you cannot meet the science-based goals of averting catastrophe on the planet. And it may not matter what an old guy like me, but somebody born today in the year 2024 will be 76 in the year 2100. And unless we do something, that is going to be a hellscape existence for that person.
Well, and you can see there are potential solutions. Lab-grown meat, for example. It's meat cells. They grow lab-grown meat. It would be a source if they could mass scale it. It would maybe eliminate the need for factory farms and the mass killing of cows. And yet, who's fighting that? Big agriculture in the Midwest is lobbying against it, calling it weird.
Yeah, look, everything's going to feel weird to people. Well, you know, there are parts of the world where the major protein source are bugs. Actually, bugs, insects
yeah.
are in sort of a way are easier to sort of develop in terms of protein than cows are. So we're going to have to change our diets. We're going to have to change the way we live and the way our economies are run, because the world dragged its feet so long, still isn't meeting its climate goals. But if we're going to avert catastrophe, we're going to have to do it quick. And just to go back to our original point, the reason that we're in the situation that we're in is because the major oil companies have done everything they can to stop progress on the climate front, and to, in fact, influence the political process in a way that led to congressional gridlock. And it's their fault. So we need them to pay for some of these things, but we need to sort of ignore the pleas of the big oil companies and their fawning allies and focus on the science.
And as my father would say, Blair, they can afford it.
They sure can. Over the last 3 calendar years, the major oil companies made almost $1 trillion in profits.
Is that all?
Yeah, a mere
trillion.
$1 trillion.
We're speaking with Blair Horner. He is the executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG. You can find out more at NYPIRG, NYPIRG.org. Blair, let's switch gears a little bit, not completely off climate, because, you know, we're in an election year. A lot of young people, a lot of people don't vote. You know, under half voting in a presidential election year, and we are in a presidential election year. I can't believe it if anybody doesn't know that based on the news headlines that have been flying this last month. But here we are. You know, there's a choice, isn't there? Both in this state on election day and on the national scene when it comes to all these issues you've been talking about.
Yeah, just to reinforce and remind the listeners that
I know.
NYPIRG is strictly nonpartisan. Not only do we not endorse, but we don't do anything to be nice to anybody, except for you, David.
Correct.
In terms of the upcoming election, you know, the nation is polarized, and in terms of, you know, when you look at the polling, it's basically neck and neck between the Democrats and Republicans in terms of national polling. And the election of who will be the next president really turns on basically a relatively small number of what are called swing states in both the Midwest and the Southwest and Georgia. I mean, those are the states that are going to determine who the next president is, assuming that, you know, the polling is right. But control of the House of Representatives is a totally different ballgame. And there, the road to control of the House of Representatives may run through New York. It did in 22. The Republicans have a very tiny majority right now, and to some extent that majority is based on the fact that Republicans were very successful in 22 in New York in flipping a number of House seats that basically gave the speakership to Speaker Johnson instead of Speaker Jeffries. Wannabe Speaker Jeffries, Leader Jeffries, the Democrat. And so the election is going to matter. The country's polarized. New York, has a Democratic enrollment majority, but it's reflected in the 15 to 11 Democrats to Republicans congressional representatives. But the new voters, who generally are the young people between 18 and 24, may have an outsized impact on who controls the Congress.
I wondered
And
how you were thinking about that. You know, in New York, you got the
yeah,
SUNYs, the schools have polling places now. We see the energy is ratcheted up since Kamala Harris now is assumed to be the nominee for president on the Democratic side after Biden stepped aside. And in election years, turnout is higher for president. And climate change is one of the single biggest issues that young people cite. Are we going to see a huge turnout this year like we haven't in the past?
who knows, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, young people
Yes.
are, they're like their older adult, other adults, and that they're split. There's no, they're not all one way or the other, but they tend to be more interested, and they should be, in terms of climate change, for example, because they're going to live with the consequences longer than the older adults are on average. And New York has a law on the books that says if there's 300 college students that live on campus that are registered to vote in New York, in that on campus address, then that campus must have a polling place for those students. And we don't know. That law hasn't really made a big difference in terms of turnout. The first year it went into effect was in 22. So we'll see if it makes a big impact in 24, making it easier for people to vote.
Blair.
I think one of the wild cards in the election, though, this November is going to be there's a ballot question about equal rights for.
Yeah, we hadn't gotten to that.
That's right. Everyone, and as well as reproductive rights. That's going to be on the ballot. And that's another issue that young people care about.
Yes.
So that may actually have more of an impact in terms of turnout than anything else.
Yeah, you're talking about the LGBTQIA, and that language, there is some talk about making it more specific. They kept it more vague, but you're right. This could be an impetus for young people to get out and vote. Are you, as NYPIRG, since you are on the college campuses in some sense, are you able to provide an information campaign this coming election? Remind students that there are polling places on those SUNY campuses, reminding students to make sure they're registered to vote. Are you able to do something like that?
That's the plan. I mean, by the way, it's not just SUNY, right? I mean, there's a lot of private colleges in New York, even though some of them have closed, Wells being the most recent one, and College of St. Rose in Albany. And that, in my view, is to some extent the failure of state policy that the private schools are on the ropes, even some of the publics are. Nevertheless, you're right, and they are, 18 to 24-year-olds that are based on a college campus have the right to register and vote from that campus address. And a lot of the, swing congressional districts, for example, in the Hudson Valley, there's a whole bunch of colleges all over the place in those districts. And whether or not the students, again, choose to register and vote from those addresses or not may determine, who the representatives are. But we'll be registering students. We usually register, around 20,000 new college student voters, and we do that on campus. We'll do everything we can to alert them to the voting options that they have. And as best as we can, we will alert them to the questions that are on the ballot. That we can do. And New York City, for example, has a number of proposals to change its charter, which will be on the ballot in the city, plus the state one that we just talked about.
Yeah, we didn't get into talking about the Bond Act and that money. And we have so many things we can talk about all the time, Blair, which is why I love having you on. He is Blair Horner, the executive director of NYPIRG. Find out more at nypirg.org. Darn it, we're out of time, Blair. Just make sure you're there if I need you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.